Emily, okay, you were called the amputee.
Did you just nominate me, Jan?
Yeah. Why don't you jump in? Because it really struck me that you were like identified primarily as that.
I mean, I think, and I know that Jan can speak to this too. When you have a visible physical disability, it introduces you into a room in a particular way. For me, I have very different experiences depending on what I'm wearing. So if I'm wearing shorts, I have people clapping at me in the grocery store, which is awkward. And if I'm not, then people sometimes are like, oh, what happened to you? What's wrong with you? Like there are a lot of really personal questions in elevators, which is always awkward as well. So I think that I teach a class called Disability, it's really original title, at the medical school. And I asked the medical school students who are kind of filing in at 8 in the morning and completely don't want to be there. I say, what do you think of when you hear the word disability? And it's usually pretty negative connotations, right? So I think that we really do have still in this culture and many cultures around the world, this idea that disability is sort of a precursor to death, or it's the worst thing that can ever happen to you, or you must be miserable, and none of those things are true. I mean, I think that, yes, it is challenging to live with a disability. Is it the only thing in my life that is challenging? Yeah, no. Is it a source of joy and pain? I mean, it can be both of those things at the same time. So I feel like the goal of my work is to say that, two contradictory things can be true at the same time, that the world and our bodies are always both and that we can't put people in these little boxes and expect them to stay there happily. So yeah, that's my short answer to that question.
Yeah, I mean, I love the fact that creativity is one of the headline words for this session, because that got me thinking about a lot of things. And I think one of the things that I took from your books certainly is the way in which the meaning of disability is so much in the eye of the beholder, right? So you're talking about people asking questions and really about people projecting answers onto you. And this is something that's fascinated me in so many different situations. I mean, I'm here in the US now, and I've been here a couple of times before. I spent a year at Berkeley as a PhD fellow. And that shift in context was transformational to me. I mean, I came here as a wheelchair user, using not this particular wheelchair, but a larger one, more like a scooter. And one of the first things that happened to me on arriving in the US was that somebody complimented me on my wheelchair. I mean, cool ride, man, is what was the line. Just at an crosswalk here in downtown Berkeley. That had never happened to me before. Never happened in Norway. And it took me a while to realize that, that wheelchair looked expensive. It was, sleek, black, financed by the Norwegian welfare state. It came across as something very different in a US context than back home. I had a number of moments like that. And from your books, Emily, you write a lot about how you're sometimes taken to be a veteran, and just how the U.S. military context shapes views of disability in so many contexts. That doesn't happen in Norway. We do have veterans, but they are so few in number that it doesn't really influence perceptions of disability in the same way. And this is just a long-winded way of saying that there's so much about the thing that is referred to sort of singularly as disability, that is really about the society in which disability has come into being as a complex social phenomenon. It tells us so much about the society that we're living in. That's one of the sort of, I would say, where the creative potential lies in exploring it.
Thoughts, Emily?
Well, I mean, there's so much I love about your book, Jan, and I think that one of the things, first of all, the beautiful writing. It's such a beautiful lyrical study, and I love the fragmented nature of it. It's so true to, I think, most people's experience in having any kind of body. But I'm so glad that you brought up the social welfare state, because I think that is, in this country, having a disability can economically destroy somebody. Prosthetic limbs are in this country between $50,000 and $100,000 baseline, and if you want the fancy stuff, you're talking even higher marks, right? And insurance, of course, does not cover much of that. So you are out of pocket for a lot of things. It's really expensive to have a disability in this country. So there's a lot of things going on with that are wildly unethical. And in terms of the veterans connection too, at least in this country, the development of better prosthetics has been fueled by people coming back from wars without their limbs and needing to have more mobility. So I started my life, and I come from a working class family, so I had a wooden leg with like the hinges that you oiled with like WD-40. Like, I'd be like, Dad, I can't bend my knee, and he'd be like, oiling it. And then now I had a computerized knee, that the knee itself was just $30,000, and my insurance at the time covered it. And now I have, one that's sort of my working leg, and am constantly kind of like trying to repair it because it's really expensive to get another one, even with really good insurance. So all of those technological advances have been fueled by military need. And I have been mistaken as a veteran, which I find incredibly odd, but also not so odd because women are in the military too, and I'm old enough that some of those people could be my children. But I had my first experiences with prosthetics with veterans, with Vietnam veterans in particular, and I'm still very active in communities where, I ski with veterans. There's this day where we all ski together here at in Southern California. We do have skiing. It's not quite the same as Norway, but it's skiing anyway. And so a lot of those, mostly men in that group, we ski every couple of months together during ski season, and we talk a lot about what it's like to have these different bodies, and most of those are men. So it's another conversation that's interesting to have, but I absolutely feel like disability in this country is made deeply problematic because it's not accessible to some of the people who need it, and that's not right. So my daughter's singing in the background. Okay, she's not.
Yeah, it always intersects with class and with capitalism, and that is the case in Norway as well. There's this, I feel like one of the things that you do in your books, and perhaps particularly in Sanctuary, is writing a counter narrative. There are all of these accepted stories, these patterns in mainstream culture on what disability is supposed to look like. And there's a creative impetus in writing against that too, trying to find the friction, try and find the places to open things up. One of the things that is interesting about having a book out and then having it be translated is that you get to read it all over again through a translator's eyes. You have to see things that you weren't able to see during the initial writing. And one of the things that made me the most uncomfortable about revisiting my book was the degree to which I'd partly played into the heroic narrative, the survival narrative, because it's almost impossible to escape. There's this sort of narrative trajectory that just pulls you in. And so these last few years of talking about the book and having it enter into conversation with other books has also been just this, for me, this attempt to try and discover what those really deep-set narrative patterns are in a way. For you, the word resilience seems really important and problematic, and that's one of the things I wanted to ask you. What does resilience mean to you? I've worked a bit with that word in my sort of previous career in working in special needs education, and I do have some issues with it. But I wanted to ask you what do you mean by resilience?
Well, I think I had a beef with the word because I kept hearing it all the time, and I've heard it most of my life. And the overcomer narrative, the sort of heroic narrative, is one that I have also inherited. As you said, it's almost impossible to leap over that. And there's a line in your book, I put a heart around it because I'm 15, but it says, "I began to write because I needed a different language than the one I was offered." So I love the way that you talk about language and narrative in this book, and the way that the narrative becomes this sort of, system of thinking and learning, and patterns of thought are changed. So After my son died, I was pregnant again very quickly, and people kept saying, "Oh, you're so resilient, you're so strong." I couldn't do that. And my favorite phrase, "I would die if I were you," which is really unhelpful. Don't say that to anyone. It's not a compliment. It's actually really rude. And it's also the title of my next book. I'm tired. I mean, it's just like, no, you wouldn't, or you would, but don't put me on a pedestal and say, "Oh, you're so resilient, you're so strong. I couldn't live your life," because that's offensive. And putting someone on a pedestal creates a distance, right? So that you can say, "Oh, this will never happen to me. I'll never have a disability. I'll never lose a child." None of those things, none is true, right? That those aren't true, like those statements. Anyway, so I started to do some research into resilience, and I realized that the root word is Latin, resilin, and it's about the fabric in the wings of butterflies and the way that they are put together, the wings themselves. So if you think about that, a butterfly is flying through the air. That's kind of hard. It's work, but you could rip it with your hands. So there's a kind of vulnerability in resilience that people want to conflate the word with the word strong, but it's not. It's about bending, right? It's about bending. And then of course the Vikings, they knew. They had the wood of their ships wasn't the strongest wood. It was the wood that would morph with the water so that it would be sort of mutated inside of the experience of travel. And that to me felt really resonant. And it was also, most of my books have been born out of sort of anger and rage. It's true. And I was just like, if someone else calls me resilient and means it is strong, I'm going to lose my mind, because I don't feel strong. My child died. He had a horrible, horrible disease, and he died horribly. Like, that is not okay. It's never going to be okay. And yes, I had a baby because I wanted to have another baby, and I wanted that really, really badly. It was the only thing I wanted. Does that make me resilient? No, I think it makes me a human being. I think we are given things in life that we don't ask for, and we figure it out. And I think everyone does that. Maybe not in such extreme ways, but I just feel like this whole thing, like, "Oh, I couldn't do it," is really isolating and alienating to the person who's actually doesn't really have a choice.
Yeah, and I'm going to pick up on that last thing, because it makes so much sense to me. You write about, if I remember the scene correctly, you're in a museum looking at some of Frida Kahlo's paintings, and there's some person talks about, she had this horrible accident, she wasn't all of this pain, but at least that made her an artist. At least sort of we got all this wonderful art out of it, which no. She was in a lot of pain and she was an artist. But there's this, I think one of the reasons why this is so, this sentiment is so offensive, I think, is that it imputes some sort of moral law to the universe. I mean, there is always a reason for the suffering. There's always a silver lining of some sort, which there isn't. It's just that these things happen, and that is part of human life. But there is this incredible, again, sort of cultural impetus towards imputing meaning towards it all, which, fine, but that's something you ascribe to it. That's not something that is intrinsic to any experience of illness, disability, or death. It's something you project onto it. So again, it's this way that the culture tries to force sense onto these experiences.
Yeah, I love that, what you said about forcing sense, because I feel like there is that kind of it's like my mom used to have these cross stitches all over the house, when God opens a door, closes a door, a window opens, or make today a yes day. I'm like, why did you put that on our walls? You have no idea what this did to me. But it's just, we want to find a meaning, and it's I think not so much about forcing meaning, but it's about finding a way. Like, everyone has to find a way to live with joy and meaning and purpose, and not everyone does. But we want to do that. We're wired to do that. In some ways, it's what we're meant to do in bodies, human bodies and even animal bodies, right? I mean, I think too, it's offensive, and it's also it's infantilizing to the person. This is something that I think is very, it's rooted in literature, right? The Tiny Tim character is has a disability, but is just so sweet, and it's always so sweet. And I think there's that, or someone used to say to me, or all the time, God's special person. I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, it's infantilizing, like patting you on the head. Like, I can't even tell you how many people have patted me on the head. I'm just like, why are you patting me on the head? Look, I'm not a dog. So I think, I think there is this kind of like, let's reserve that sort of, oh, they're special, they're better, they're better people, the pain makes them these strong moral beings, and it's like pain makes them artists. Like, pain doesn't create anything. Pain is just pain. Like, you experience it, you get out of it, you experience it again. And in my last book, the Frida Kahlo book, she had a ton of pain. She was in pain a lot. That was not a muse for her. Anyone who's experienced physical pain knows that doesn't create art. It creates pain. And I don't know why we're so insistent on saying that, like, the struggle has a meaning. She struggled, and then she made art. Exactly what you said. She was, like, completely in bed, and she's like, well, I want to paint, so I'm going to find a way to paint in bed, right? And there was not a lot of, like, oh, I'm so brave and so awesome. She was a painter, and she had a particular set of circumstances to deal with, and she dealt with them. Yeah. Period.
Yeah, it's also about reclaiming subjectivity, right? Because this sort of what you were talking about just now is also just this way of talking about the disabled experience as something that plays out for the benefit of others, for the moral education of non-disabled people. I mean, that's the essence of the Tiny Tim character, right? It's he is there in order to change Scrooge and his moral trajectory. He has no subjectivity of his own. And that's also the thing that crops up in the Frida Kahlo paintings. It's somehow all of this is for the benefit of the spectator, for the other. That's at least, I think that's been sort of the key issue for me in trying to find a relevant language, a language that I can actually deploy for my own purposes. It's about writing against the grain of that objectifying discourse. The thing that is always trying to turn you into something really that is there for others to consider.
Yeah, well, exactly, and it's kind of like, I mean, someone said to me once, when I was living in Santa Fe and my son was dying, I became this person who shouted at people, like in Trader Joe's, because they would just say these things like, looking at you puts my life into perspective. I'm so lucky. Like, I feel so blessed. And I was like, it felt like, first of all, the whole #blessed. So I often felt like, I was rocking up to these places in my, like, jalopy car and the #cursed, and then these people were, like, driving up in Porsches and being like, #blessed. And I think that's definitely linked to sort of American ideals of, if you work hard enough, if you're pretty enough, if you're rich enough, then nothing bad will ever happen to you. Of course, that's completely untrue. But that kind of, like, the person with a disability exists as a foil, right? As in literature as well, and also, like many difficult things, we have the Bible to thank for that as well, because in the healing narratives, people with disabilities are used by Jesus in the story to illuminate something else, like, this man can now walk. And if you believe, you'll be healed. So the healing narratives are deeply problematic and have caused a lot of woe, I think, for people with disabilities, because even though we don't necessarily consider, people don't walk around, well, some people do, walking around thinking about the Bible all the time. It's a part of our culture here. And those narratives are powerful. And so when I was studying theology, one of my main beefs was, like, there's got to be a different way to interpret these texts in their original language, which there is. And it's not so much about using the person with disability to educate. It's something much more radical than that. But it was watered down for sort of different audiences. But anyway, that's another topic.
Yeah, there's these metaphors of embodiment are so deeply rooted in our culture. There's the biblical tradition. There's also the whole, of course, the roots of Western philosophy are all about these imputations of the body being a mirror of the mind somehow, that you can extrapolate a person's moral character from the way they look, from the way they move. It's very, very hard getting away from that. But again, that's sort of where the creative impetus lies, riding against the grain.
Mm-hmm.
But there was something else I wanted to bring up, which is, well, you in your book about Frida Kahlo, you talk about sort of the temptation to think that you fully understand her, and then at the same time realizing that of course you don't. There's this. Again, this is I'm going to loop back for a bit, because in my book I use the word disability just once when I talk about what I do at work, working in academic disability studies. I consciously avoided that word, and I think it was probably a necessary choice. It brought me closer to my own particular embodied existence. I mean, I spend a couple of pages writing about how I move, trying to get up from a sofa, from a couch, and I couldn't, or I didn't want to write about that in terms of moving like a disabled person, because that's not sufficiently specific. I needed to talk about how I use my muscles, how I get into a particular position, how I can brace against pieces of furniture, that kind of thing. It's a very particular physical experience. It's my experience. And at the same time, there are issues in avoiding the word disability, which is, of course, distancing myself from the whole of disabled experience. And I think I've come to think about this partly in terms of family resemblances, that there is probably not one thing that every disabled person has in common, and yet there are all of these connections, links, commonalities of experience. I mean, I know that I noted down tons of them in reading your books. Although our experiences have been different, to put it mildly, there were so many points of connection. So I wanted to ask you about, well, particularly about your sort of connection to and distance from somebody like Frida Kahlo, what it means to write about that.
Yeah. This was the hardest book to write. It was the shortest one that I've ever written, and it was because I was like, I don't really, like, I'm not an art critic. I have no idea, I just see something and I'm like, I like that. That's my art critic. Like, that's the sum of my abilities to assess art. But I had this two big kind of rupturous moments in my life that made me think that there was something in here. And the first was when I saw one of her paintings. I just felt like, I just felt so connected to it. Even though I didn't share all of the elements of that experience, there was some kind of visual narrative that matched my own movement narrative, like how I moved through rooms, exactly what you were saying. Like, my patterns of movement somehow, I found them in this visual representation of her work. And so then I became, really interested in her and read all the stuff, and as you do when you're in high school and you like latch on to something, but it just never left me. It was the weird thing. And then when I went to the Frida Kahlo exhibit in Mexico City, and I did not know that she had a prosthetic limb until that moment. And so I'm walking in this room, and it's like these beautiful decorated limbs, and like, I'm just like stunned, and I'm like hugely pregnant, so I'm like sweating and like standing in front of these legs, like having a moment. And I just thought, wow, no one saw those. Like, she had these beautiful things that she made, and she hid them. And I was just so fascinated by that, because I can completely relate to that. Like, having a body that you're proud of, but parts of that you hide if you can. And then there's this kind of subversive thing to say, like, yeah, no one can see these beautiful things unless they really know me. Which is a kind of counter narrative to the thing I often hear from people is like, oh, I don't think of you as disabled. I'm like, that doesn't even make sense to me. Like, then you don't see me, right? This whole identity issue. So I think Frida, and the reason I was, of course, also nervous to write about Frida Kahlo is that I'm not from that culture. I don't know anything I don't speak Spanish. I didn't grow up in Mexico. But so I felt that where I connected with her was, the way I might connect with any other writer or artist whose work I admire. I just felt like she was saying something different about the disability experience visually, that had this really strong narrative that I wanted to tap into, and that's been hugely helpful for me in my own work and in my own life. Like I have a deep connection with my idea of who she was. So that's, of course, that's all I can have.
But it's hugely productive, right? I mean, and for me, it was Franklin Roosevelt. I write about this in my last book, which came out in Norway this fall. Of just seeing these images of him at Warm Springs, where there are so few images of him, not in sort of full presidential mode, but there are a few. And there's this one image of him in the bathing suit, where you can see him with his very thin legs. And I just got sort of this first seeing that image, I got this flash of, oh, those are my legs, which of course they're not. But at the same time, there's a connection there. I've come to think that it has very little to do, perhaps, with embodied experience, but it has everything to do with social experience. Because the more I read about that, sort of that masquerade of presenting as able-bodied, of presenting as cured, presenting as non-disabled, I thought, okay, well, I know what that is. And of course, there's sort of all of these things of thinking with the stories of famous historical figures, learning about how we got the Secret Service to build hidden ramps in order to be able to access buildings, thinking that would be nice. But yeah, they're just latching onto this sort of particular mode of social existence rather than the actual embodied existence. That has been just hugely interesting for me.
Oh, it's so true, and it's true for so many other kinds of embodied experiences, right? So I run this class for women who've lost children. It's a writing class. We've been together for almost 3 years, and it's like magic unicorn bubbles. Like, it's just the best thing, because everyone in that room has lost their child a different way, is from a different social class, different background, different culture, different parts of the country, but we share this one very specific social experience of being the mother that had the worst thing ever happen to her. And that is what connects us. And so the rest of it, it's not that it doesn't matter, but in that space, there's this just like, it's like a laser beam. Like, we can all meet around this one really hard thing. And what makes it really hard, as many people know from grieving, is that when you go out in the world, your social experience of being a griever is really hard. That's the hardest thing about it in some ways. Like, the other hard things too. But so all of us have that social experience. So I really like that you bring it into that realm of, you all right? Of it's embodied experience. We all have it, right? We all feel things in our body. That's where we feel things first. We don't think, oh, I'm feeling this, and then feel it. We feel it. And I feel like, at least in our culture, we're so removed from that idea, because we are also rooted in this idea that the body's actually kind of nasty. Like, the body is a sinful body, and you have to control it, and you have to shape it at your will. And it's kind of excruciating to think about it sometimes, right? It's just so limiting.
Yeah.
I love this moment in your book, Jan, when you say, first of all, there's a couple things that I really love about this book. There's so many things, but I love that you bring in other thinkers and writers and people and different perspectives. I feel like in nonfiction, so often, especially in the memoir space, people think, oh, they're sort of very much focused on their own experience, but our experience is shaped by how we think and what we read and the narratives that we download. And so I just loved that part of it. And then this line too, I'm not going to get a tattoo of this on my body because I think it's weird when people say that to writers. Like, but it is and it isn't like this. It's exactly right. It's like it can be these two things that don't seem like they can hold together in the same space, but they do, right? Yeah. And I wish that people would understand that that's a better way to live. I think
yeah.
It's just
No, the ambiguity and the liminal spaces. There was another really crucial point of connection for me was when you talk about seeing your prosthetic leg being worked on, being I guess WD-40 was being put onto a joint of some sort, but you're talking about that sort of that deeply strange sense of seeing something that is not your body, but also your body, being treated in this incredibly mechanical way. I had an experience very much like that the last time I was in Berkeley, when we were sort of starting to get the sense that COVID might not be the tiny issue that we'd hoped it would be. And I did what I often do. I became neurotic about my wheelchair, because that's an interesting way of projecting things, right? And so I had it had some issues with some mechanical issues, long story. But I got a mechanic here in town to look at it, which, because the repair shop had hardly any money, meant that they used a lift that had been donated, a thing that's usually used to lift a human body in care homes or in settings where people need to be lifted out of their beds. So they outfitted that with chains, and they used it to hoist up one part of the wheelchair in order to unscrew a lid, look at some mechanical parts, and it felt very much like being in surgery for me. It's this sense of extreme vulnerability, because if something is actually seriously wrong, I will not be able to move about in the way that I usually do without thinking about my movements. I mean, most wheelchair users have this sense of their body extending exactly to the limits of their chairs, although of course it's not the same thing at all. There is this sense of the body having very permeable boundaries, in a sense. And the mechanic used a wonderful term at the end of that process. He said, well, okay, so there wasn't anything actually wrong, but let's say that we made a diagnostic repair. And I thought that's exactly right. And it's got just the right kind of medical slant to it. That was what that experience was like, tightening a few bolts, diagnostic repair.
So interesting. Oh my gosh, just like the image of that, it being hoisted up, and yeah, it's the sort of removal from oneself. I mean, when my prosthetist, who was my prosthetist in 1990, started making me legs that weren't wooden, he retired this year, and I was like, you can't. Like, what are you doing? And he's like, I'm retiring. And I'm like, you don't understand. Like, you've been building this part of my body for 25 years. Like, how can you retire? He's like, dude, I'm retiring. So, but I mean, it has been a struggle for me. Like, I haven't been able to find someone that I feel like I have, like, who I'm comfortable with. Most prosthetists are men, so that's awkward. But you know, I have some females now, but it's not the same. It's not Bill. So I feel like he, in some ways, even though I only saw him 3 or 4 times a year, is responsible for everything I do. You know, it's a very interesting relationship. And my first prosthetist, of course, was very different. And he would smoke. You know, he'd smoke, and while he was working on it, you know, and I would hold his ashtray while his sticks, and he'd be like, you know, and then he'd put it out, and you know, I mean, it was just like, and it's in Denver actually, and I went back there, and it's now it's a pot shop. It's like a marijuana store. And I was like, it's so perfect. But it was just like, it was like a dirty car parts place. And you went in there and you felt dirty, you know? And everyone was smoking, and like, I mean, it was just so gross. So I feel like both of those men all these men that have been building my body over the years, you know, this is the first time I haven't had a man working on my leg. It's now a woman. And it's just so complicated, you know?
We should probably take some questions from the audience. Is that all right? 2 of you? Yeah?
Absolutely.
All right. Right in front here. Yeah, we're bringing a microphone around.
I had thoughts of 3 books as you were talking, and I was thinking if it makes sense, if one of you could address one of the 3 books or not. But just, the first one was Barbara Ehrenreich's Bright-Sided. And I'm also thinking about Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto. But I'm going back to kind of a favorite, Pangloss's comment in Candide of all for the best in the best of all possible worlds, or something like that. So anyway, if it amuses or interests either of you in any of those three, I'd like you to comment.
Sure. Emily, do you want to?
I have the one that I know of those three would be the Cyborg Manifesto, which I read and loved. I mean, I think that I don't know how much I have to say about it, only that I think now with the rise of social media, there is a lot more of the images of people with mechanical sort of devices available to us. And it's been a long time since I've read it, so I don't know if I have a ton to say, but I think those are, I have the Aaron Reich book, but I just haven't read it.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, I did read the Aaron Reich book, so I can comment briefly on that. But she talks about this in different books, right? It's a critique of this sort of an enforced optimism for people labeled survivors. But I think you're absolutely right that your suggestion that it goes back to what Voltaire was satirizing in Candide, with the notion that we're living in the best of all possible worlds, which is, I guess, ultimately it goes back to sort of the Christian tradition of theodicy. Would that be the English version? The sort of the trying to find a way to justify why the world is what it is, why God has made the world with evil in it. And so I forget who Voltaire was satirizing. Was it Leibniz? Well, one of the philosophers who was trying to work out this very elaborate justification that we must be living in the best of all possible worlds, which clearly we're not.
Leibniz.
Yeah, exactly, Leibniz. But yeah, I mean, it's a very deeply rooted cultural phenomenon, certainly in philosophy. But it's interesting to me that the most devastating critique of that has come from literature, just really sort of a close examination of the world as it actually is.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Next question. Oh, back there in the white jacket.
Hi there. Ooh. Good afternoon. I so appreciate you bringing up the topic of, well, as you put it, reclaiming the subjective experience. And I'm so moved by that. And speaking as a grad student in counseling psychology, what I'm wondering, in America at least, 1 in 4 have some sort of disability, whether it's visible or not. And hearing you talk about the social experience, certainly people with, especially visible disabilities, are at, would you say, increased risk for isolation?
I mean, statistically speaking, yeah, for sure. I mean, at greater risk for nearly everything, I would say. So, I mean, lower levels of education, lower levels of income. I mean, there's no question that disability is, a capital B bad thing. The reasons why that is the case is that's the interesting issue, right? And trying to look at ways that, at systematic differences across nations, let's say, across different political models. There's no question that if you're disabled in Norway, there's a much lower chance of you being poor because the welfare state is there, but the chance of you being employed is roughly the same as in the US. Those sort of mechanisms of exclusion are more or less the same.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think what you're talking with the whole the issue here, at least, and that's what I tell my students all the time, is like you're writing underneath these systems. You're writing in a place. You're writing under a capitalist system. You're writing under, a racist system. Like you don't have to ascribe to those things, but you have to acknowledge that you have a position in the system. And it's certainly, I mean, disability is, I don't know the exact statistics, but I know a lot of people in the disabled community who, are deeply impoverished because they're not able to get the resources that they want because they're not considered people who can contribute to the capitalist machine. So if you don't have value as someone who's contributing to the machine, then your body is no longer a value. And obviously we could go on and on about that, but I certainly feel like, one of the roles of memoirs and literature is, in giving that to potential patients, is to see the different ways of making it work. And community, of course, also always comes back to community.
Can I just follow up a question? Emily, in your book, I loved how you talked about how Frida Kahlo dressed so much, and which sort of drew attention away from her injuries. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Oh, yes. Yes, I have always been all about the clothes. I love clothes. I've just embraced it now. I have not enough room for my clothes. I love shopping. I love outfits, right? So, and part of it is because, and there's two things, and this, I don't know if this will resonate with you, Jan, but I understood from a very young age that if I looked a certain way and I was funny, I could belong. That's why I'm funny. I mean, I am funny, but I don't know if I would have been this, right? And there's a scene actually, so yes, I definitely understand the elaborate, actually, I have students who write on their evaluations, her clothes are totally weird. And I'm like, sweet, my work is done, So I'm always after the kind of distraction, for sure. But there's a scene in Walk the Line, the movie about Johnny Cash and June Carter Cash, where they're sitting in this bar and he's like, oh, I've listened to your records all my life. And the woman, Reese Witherspoon, plays June Carter. She says, oh, my sister's really the one that has the best voice. She's like, that's why I'm funny. She's like, so I would have something to offer. And so I feel like that has definitely been, I do very much identify with that about Frida Kahlo, is that I have some epic outfits and very weird taste. Weird, meaning I'm not gonna wear a black suit to teach my class. I'm gonna wear clashing animal prints and a fascinator, because why not? And humor. So yeah, that was another way in which I very deeply connected with her. There was an unfortunate time in the late 90s when I tried to do the braids. That was not cute. It did not work on me. But yeah, certainly, the presentation of the body, and especially as a woman, I know it matters.
Yeah, and it really matters. I've gone the exact opposite route, just sort of trying to present, as normal as possible, because that's also, it's a strategy. Not always the best strategy, but it's there. But I think in either case, you gave the funny answer, so I can give the serious answer, which is that vulnerability leads to hypervigilance. You're always aware of how you're presenting. You're always aware of the performative aspect of your being in the world, and that includes clothes. That includes everything you can influence.
Yep.
Other questions? Let's see. I think the woman in the burgundy had her hand up first.
Hi, I wondered if you had thoughts about, you started off talking about Tiny Tim and how disabled people were moral examples. And then there's the opposite part of that, people like Captain Hook and Richard III, the evil disabled person, and also, the brave disabled person making their way in the world. But then if you actually ask for what you need, like a chair you can sit in or maybe even a job, you expect special treatment just for you. So, those opposites, do you have something to say on that?
Yeah, I see them as being part of the same continuum, really, because Captain Hook and all of the disabled villains throughout history and culture, they're moral examples too, right? Because inevitably they get their comeuppance, and also they are sufficiently explained to us. We know exactly why they're evil, and so they provide, again, this sort of examples of this karmic logic. So I see it as part of very much the same thing.
Yeah, I think I had this moment when I was a kid, and I'd seen something with Captain Hook. I don't know what it was, this long time ago, and I told my mom I was going to be a pirate, right? Because I had this leg and I had the peg leg or whatever, and she's like, no, we're not doing that. And I was really committed to it. I was like, I'm going to get a patch and I'm going to get some ripped jeans. And she was just mortified. She was just like completely mortified. But I think it was like, I mean, yeah, he was evil, but I was identifying, there's this kind of like deformity or whatever means that somehow there's something bad in your mind, right? I think the most complex sort of recent depiction of that was in the show Vikings with Ivar the Boneless, the actor that played him. It was so complicated and weird and emotionally interesting that, I mean, it was almost hard for me to watch it because it was so, he played the part so well. That's definitely something that I would love someone to watch and unpack, like I'm gonna do with my students next quarter. But
Sorry,
yeah,
sorry, Emily, can you say the name again for the translator?
Could you
was
say
that?
the name again of the?
So Ivar the Boneless was a Viking guy who was historically true, and he used like he would drag himself with his arms, and they made him a chair, and he was apparently one of the most brutal rulers or Vikings. I mean, none of them were really gonna get props for being kind, I suppose, but I think he was supposed to be one of the worst. But the man, a Danish actor, plays him in this show, and he is probably the most well-rounded, complicated, interesting character in the entire series. So it's just an interesting depiction of disability and the way that it shapes someone in that particular time when, obviously there weren't, computer legs or whatever. Like, it's just a really, really fascinating and complicated and disturbing depiction.
And that's
so I was into it because I was like, this is not just like, oh, he's deformed and evil, or oh, he's so moral. He was just a person.
And that was a series called The Vikings.
Yeah, so
right?
good.
Okay, great. Question, let's see, the gray sweatshirt, blue mask. See, I'm identifying people by their clothes. That's terrible.
Hi, you're both such wonderful performers, but Emily, what you just said about the Vikings made me want to ask Jan about his own experience actually being in a major Netflix series and playing a character, which I think many people in the room won't know about.
Yeah, okay, well, thanks. That's and I do actually love talking about that experience. Yeah, this was Occupied, the political thriller about Norway being occupied by Russia, totally unrealistic sci-fi stuff. Recorded back in 2019 in a different world. So yeah, I was asked to audition for that. Because Norway is a small country, we all need to have multiple jobs. And in the script, I was supposed to play an advisor, a PR advisor to the Prime Minister in that series, just sort of a neutral information-providing character. So something's going on, somebody needs to explain it to the Prime Minister and therefore to the audience. And then the script was rewritten pretty hastily, and that character became a villain after I'd been cast. So he became a sort of secondary villain in a wheelchair, which was interesting. It seemed like it was one of those instances where the language and the narrative took on a life of its own. That's how these things work. That's how this character needs to be. And I had a couple of conversations with other actors, not implying that I'm an actor, but with the actors during filming, where they hadn't thought about that. He's not supposed to be like a stereotypical crippled villain. He's just one of these calculating, icy villain types who happens to be in a wheelchair. I'm not sure if there's a moral to that story, but it was a really interesting experience of seeing how these cultural patterns can assert themselves sort of very independently of intentions, of agency. They're just there, almost encoded in so many of us. But yeah, check it out on Netflix.
What is the
Great
title?
show.
It's called Occupied.
Occupied.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, on Netflix. I think we have time, yes, for one more question.
Thank you. Yeah, you talked about resilience. And when I think of resilience, we're facing climate change, and the talk is about how do you be resilient against the challenge and the circumstance. And then you referenced the etymological root of the word resilience is pertaining to vulnerability. So I didn't. Can you elaborate on that? Because I still don't quite see the connection between what I just shared with you.
About the word resilience?
Yes.
Yeah. So it's kind of like bend instead of break. So you have to be pliable and malleable. And I think that there's a vulnerability to saying like, I'm overwhelmed, and that can be a part of resilience versus like, I'm going to power through. So the root word, which is Latin, resilin, is just basically about these fibers that are stitched together, and they're strong to do one thing, but they are also easily destroyed. So I think when we talk about resilience and climate change, I think a lot of times people are using it as a synonym for strong or fighting back or powering through. And the word doesn't really mean that. It means sort of like bend around things to make it happen, like be flexible, be vulnerable. You might have to bend a certain way that feels uncomfortable, and then you'll get used to it. Like it's not this kind of pushing power, like kind of like boot camp idea, which is how I think it was used at least in the context when people were talking to me about it. Like I was some like warrior or something, and I wasn't. I was like falling apart, and I was starting something new that took strength and courage, but I was also falling apart. I'm not sure that answers your question, but.
Well, we have time for one more quick question. We have a minute. Anyone? Yes, last one. Okay, go ahead. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay, so I have this question of when the society have some expectation as a disabled person, say, oh, you should be proud of yourself or you're super whatever. How you resist internally against that? That doesn't shape your personality also, like how it affects you inside in a way that maybe it also you are trained based on that afterward, like any other individual in the society, which that taught teach them. Then even the main subject also is taught by that, and then they see themselves differently afterward. So if you can comment on that
Yeah.
part of.
So, if I understood you correctly, then you're talking about ways to resist the sort of the demand for productivity. That's part of it, and I don't really have a good answer to that because I've internalized this to such an extent. I mean, my safeguard against falling into poverty, all that kind of thing, has been to work really, really hard. And that was a strategy that worked for me because of my family background, my class background, all of those things. That's not a strategy that will work for everyone because capitalism is ruthless that way. But I think that the best other strategy that I know of is the one that we've been discussing today. It's about finding ways to tell different stories and to draw on art. It's still making art in the capitalist world, but at least you can try to tell different stories that are not just about living up to expectations.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Emily, do you have a last word?
I mean, Jan said it perfectly. I think it's just about flipping the script. I mean, every time you can flip the script, you should.
Wonderful.